Hey guys, and welcome back to another Theology Thursdays. This is our second week in this new series that we've started. And so, just to reiterate some things, go ahead and leave some questions in the comments if you want to have your question answered in this session perhaps, or maybe in the weeks ahead. So we have three questions that were asked either last week or sometime during this week that we're going to tackle today, and we'll answer your follow-up questions as we have time. But we're trying to get through this quickly again, and just as a final reminder for this session anyway, theology exists. Theology exists so that we can plumb the depths, so that we can understand more clearly, more deeply the gospel, namely who this God is and who has loved us so, and what our responsibility therefore is. Our first question today is, I think was a joke from last week, but we're going to go ahead and answer it anyway. And the question is, could God create a rock too heavy for him to lift? Now, this is a conundrum that people have wrestled over for ages, it would seem. But it's really just a funny question. The reason that I think that it's worth answering instead of just dismissing out of hand is because the answer is actually better than the question itself. So the question, could God create a rock too heavy for him to lift, is answered in the following ways. When we think of God creating something, or when we think of God's power, we often just take human strength and then maximize it to the full. So we think of the strongest people that we know, like the Incredible Hulk or bodybuilding contests or things like that, and we think that power or strength is synonymous with physical might. And God created everything, and not by physical might, but by the word of his power. So even there, we already have a misnomer, a mistaken category in trying to understand the power of God or what he is capable of. But let's say that we accept that and we move on in our mistake of equating physical power with the word of power that God exhibits. If we did so, we would find that what our question is really asking is, can water be dry? Or can light be dark? You see, we're asking a question that is illogical even in its foundations. You're asking if something can exist and not exist in the exact same way at the exact same time. And of course, the answer is no. That's a nonsense kind of question. But it's even more nonsense than water being dry or light being dark, because we're talking about God, the source of all reality. What the question is really getting at is, could God be at war with himself? Is there a contention of wills, a competition, if you will, between the nature, the persons even, of the Godhead? And the answer is no. Would God be more like God if the answer to this question could be yes? Would God be more godlike if he could be at war with himself? Would the perfect being who is completely unified, and theologically we say simple, would we think that God is more godlike if he could be at war with himself? Even today in contemporary culture, we would call that psychosis, right? If somebody is competing against their own mind. And for some reason, we think that this question stumps the reality of God, because he can't, if he's all powerful, then he can't do these things. No. If you are asking this question, the picture in your mind of who God is false. You're not asking if God could do this. You're asking if anybody could do this. And if you're talking about God, on the other hand, the answer, of course, is no. God is perfect in integrity. He has his perfect will, which is not at war with himself. He has a simple, unified reality that he is driving toward throughout all of history. The second question that we have is, does God feel emotion? Now, this is a little bit of an interesting question, in part because traditionally Christianity has taught that God is something called impassive. And impassive is sometimes equated with meaning not feeling emotion, that he is void of emotion, void of having feeling, etc., etc. That's not really what the term impassive means, although it may have been thought to be that at one time. Impassive means that God cannot be acted upon. In other words, God is not the victim of your good feelings or your bad feelings. God is not something that you can do things to, but rather God is, again, the source of reality. He is the one who determines the course of history, who orchestrates life itself. And so, does God feel emotion? Well, if you can't do something to make God angry or sad without him willing to be angry or sad or even joyous and happy, then that doesn't mean that God doesn't feel emotion. You could think of, well, let me give you an example. So let's say I have a 5-year-old kid. I don't, but let's say I have a 5-year-old kid, and I give him, or my wife gives him, money for Father's Day and says, go and buy me a gift for Father's Day, because I want him to experience this, the idea, the act of giving and the act of love and how that might play out in other things. Now, I'm the one who has given him money. I'm the one who has determined what that money is going to be spent for. And yet, even when my 5-year-old kid goes to the store and picks out an ugly tie and then brings it to me, I know that I will feel joy or happiness or pride in my child. So in a similar fashion, God can feel emotion, but it is not because we do something against him. It's not a human emotion that suffers from disappointment or surprise and expectations not being met or being met, but rather it is an emotion, or it is a feeling, if you want to use the word feeling, that God himself has determined, this is how I will feel when this thing happens. God is the prime director and orchestrator of all things. So yes, he can feel emotion, but he will feel how he has determined to feel based on his goodwill and pleasure and the law that he has set forward, and then the way that you respond to that law. So God knows that he will be upset and angry when we fail to live up to his righteousness, and he knows that we will that he will feel pride and joy and favor when we, by the power of his Son and the Spirit, live up to his will. The next question, is God male? Now, I know there's lots of discussion about gender and all of that, and biology and sex and et cetera today, and I'm not trying to answer those questions. What I'm trying to do is give you a theological perspective on this question, is God male? It's a perspective that is based upon Scripture. It's a perspective that is informed by tradition and history, by which I mean not just the past 50 years or 100 years. I mean thousands of years of describing God in tradition and history. And then I would hope sharpened against the steel of culture, so that we can better apply the needle to our own hearts in exploration of the gospel. So the question is God male? Now, when we get to Scripture, we don't find a quick answer. Now, that seems like we're catching you off guard. That of course it says that God is Father. Well, yeah, it does say that God is Father in the New Testament, but it also in Isaiah says that God will bounce the Israel on a knee like a babe. And of course, the picture there is feminine in construct. When it was written, that would have been a predominantly female act. And so let's go back even further, and we look at Genesis, and we see that God created man and woman, and the text says, in his own image he created them. And almost as a subtext, or like a colon, parentheses, it says, male and female, he created them. So there seems to be, even in the creation account in Genesis 1 and chapter 2, specifically Genesis 1 verses 26 and following, we see that God doesn't seem to have gender. In fact, being created man and woman seems to express the identity of God more clearly than just being created male or just being created female. And so I guess it makes sense, right? God created everything, and sure, everything in our experience has a gender, even if certain sea creatures can switch gender from one to the other under certain strenuous circumstances. We still see things in a kind of male-female dichotomy. So it's weird for us to think of someone existing who is not either male or female. Yet that's not the end of the answer. You see, it goes a little bit further, because Scripture does primarily use masculine attributes or acts to describe what God is like. And while some people might look at this and say, oh, it is just because we're using human terms, human analogies, so that we can better express what God is like. So he is like a father, or he is like a judge. And those traditionally have been masculine roles. But I think that it goes one step further. Yes, those things are true, and yes, it is more readily, it has been for several thousand years, been more readily acceptable to describe God as a male, because that was the culture, the society elevated the male status, but that doesn't mean that that's the only reason. You can imagine, for example, if Scripture had said at one point God is Father, or that the mighty hand of God, and describes in male pronouns, his hand will accomplish this thing, and then the next chapter it talks about a female God. In a polytheistic culture, this would have been interpreted as God. There is a male God and there is a female God, and they are perhaps lovers, or they are married. In fact, maybe that's why we get married, is because God himself is married to another eternal female goddess. But that's not what we find in Scripture. In fact, when we look to Scripture, we see that God is described as male primarily, preeminently, because we, the church, are described as female. In other words, when we describe God as sexless or without gender, and we take that to the uttermost, or if we go even one step further and say our mother goddess, this and that, we are truncating. I mean, it's like limiting or taking away the true value that the church can offer. We are the church. The church is female in Scripture, and it is seen as a beautiful thing. It is seen as the woman coming to the man and uniting in love. Jesus the Son died on behalf of his bride, so that he might save us, so that he might rescue us and bring us to his home. This is a metaphor that, again, traditionally is for thousands of years, this is a beautiful picture. And by saying that God is female, or that God is without gender, and to say that the church is therefore I guess genderless as well, we lose out on some of the value, some of the understanding that should come with being the church. Again, traditionally, the male or the masculine person in the marriage would be the giver, the provider, the one who determines and ordains. And again, traditionally, the female would be the one who receives, who makes a home, who sustains life. And in Scripture, we see that to be true as well. So the Father and the Son and the Spirit seems to also be take on some more of those feminine roles of sustaining life that is talked about even back in Genesis. But when we understand, or when we look at God as being male and the church as being female, we understand our role as a church a little bit better. We are not responsible for determining the order of creation. The father, the husband, the groom does that. He is the one who builds the home. But as the church, we who are female sustain life, build life, bring others into the home. We receive the love which was given to us by the husband, and we return that love and affection as well. With that, thank you for tuning in to another Theology Thursday. And leave your questions in the comments here on Instagram or on Facebook, and hopefully we'll have a chance to get to them next week. So, see you later.